It was a calm and ordinary afternoon on a flight bound for a major city. Passengers were settling into their seats, placing carry-ons in the overhead bins, and quietly chatting amongst themselves. The hum of the engines outside blended with the soft murmur inside the cabin. The atmosphere was relaxed, the kind of calm that travelers look forward to after the hustle and bustle of airports. But what no one knew was that this flight would soon turn into an unforgettable lesson about respect, dignity, and humility. About 20 minutes before takeoff, a young man in his early 20s stepped into the airplane. He was wearing a bright red hoodie, and his blonde hair was messy, as though he had rushed to the airport. He had large headphones hanging around his neck, and his face was marked with frustration. As he made his way down the aisle, his expression only grew more irritated. He was clearly unhappy with something, whether it was the cramped plane, the middle seat assignment he had, or just life in general, no one could tell. As the young man scanned the rows, his eyes locked on an aisle seat about halfway through the plane. Sitting there was an elderly man who appeared to be in his 70s. The elderly man had dark skin, white hair, and a neatly pressed beige sweater that gave him an air of quiet dignity. He was reading a book, completely unaware of the storm headed his way. The young man stopped abruptly and pulled his ticket out of his pocket. His scowl deepened. He stood over the elderly man and said, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear, "Hey! That's my seat. Get up now." The elderly man looked up, his expression calm and composed. He closed his book slowly, marking the page with a ribbon, and said, "I believe this is my assigned seat. Are you sure you're in the right row?" The young man held up his ticket like it was evidence in a courtroom. "This is 14C. That's my seat. You need to move to the middle one." His tone was sharp, almost demanding. Nearby passengers began to turn their heads. A mother sitting across the aisle glanced over, concern flashing across her face. A business traveler 2 rows back lowered his laptop, clearly sensing that something was about to unfold. The elderly man glanced at the ticket and then at his own. His voice remained calm and respectful as he replied, "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding. This is my seat. If you'd like, we can ask the flight attendant to confirm." But the young man was having none of it. "No need to confirm anything. I'm telling you, that's my seat, and I don't want to sit in the middle." His voice was rising now, and the tension in the cabin was palpable. The elderly man didn't flinch. Instead, he simply said, "Young man, this seat was assigned to me. I'd suggest we resolve this calmly. Perhaps we can get assistance from the crew." The young man scoffed, muttering something under his breath as he stormed off down the aisle. Moments later, he returned, this time with a flight attendant in tow. She was a woman in her 30s with a calm yet authoritative demeanor. "Ma'am, this guy is in my seat," the young man blurted out, pointing accusingly at the elderly man. "I paid for this flight, and I'm not sitting in the middle seat." The flight attendant smiled politely and said, "All right, let's take a look at your tickets to confirm the seating." She checked the young man's ticket first, then the elderly man's. Her response was clear, "Sir, this seat is assigned to the gentleman here. Your assigned seat is the middle one, 14B. The young man's face turned red with frustration. "You've got to be kidding me. I'm not sitting in that cramped spot. He can take it instead." The flight attendant's tone remained professional but firm. "I'm sorry, sir, but seating assignments are fixed. If the gentleman is willing to switch, that's entirely up to him. Otherwise, I'll have to ask you to sit in your assigned seat." The elderly man shook his head gently. "I appreciate the offer, but I'd prefer to keep my assigned seat. Thank you." The young man groaned loudly, throwing his hands up in exasperation. "This is ridiculous." He glared at the elderly man one last time before storming back to the middle seat, muttering curses under his breath. As he slumped into his seat, several passengers exchanged knowing looks. A woman near the window whispered to her husband, "Some people have no respect these days." A man across the aisle quietly applauded the elderly man's composure. But the story wasn't over yet. About an hour into the flight, the plane encountered turbulence. The cabin shook lightly at first, but soon the bumps grew more intense. The seatbelt sign flashed on, and passengers gripped their armrests. The young man, who had been sulking in silence, suddenly looked panicked. He clutched the sides of his seat, his face pale. The elderly man, noticing the change, leaned slightly toward him. "Are you all right, young man?" he asked, his voice filled with genuine concern. The young man hesitated before nodding quickly. I'm fine," he stammered, though his shaky voice betrayed his fear. The elderly man smiled kindly. "It's normal to feel uneasy during turbulence. Just take deep breaths and try to relax. We'll get through it." The young man glanced at him, surprised by the gesture. For a moment, the tension between them seemed to fade. The turbulence eventually passed, and the cabin settled into a calm once again. As the flight neared its end, the young man turned to the elderly man. His expression had softened, and his voice was quieter now. I'm sorry about earlier. I was out of line." The elderly man nodded with a gentle smile. "We all have our moments. What matters is that we learn from them." When the plane landed, the young man was among the first to stand. But instead of rushing off, he took a moment to help an older woman retrieve her bag from the overhead compartment. He even held the door for other passengers as they exited the plane. Sometimes, it takes a small act of kindness to remind us of what truly matters. If you believe in the power of respect and understanding, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's spread a message of kindness together.